You're on.
Okay, you're all set. Well, thanks everybody for joining. This is something that's kind of new to me, and I hopefully will be able to use this Zoom medium to share a story that I put together here that I think is it may be interesting to you. If you've joined, you must have some interest in genealogy, and I want to thank Alan Cahan and the Federation of Jewish Men's Club for organizing this. If you're not aware, the Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs have been doing about anywhere from 3 to 5 of these on a host of different topics every week. And this has been kind of a hobby of mine for the last 20 plus years. So I thought, well, I'll share my story. So thank you for setting this thing up, Alan. And so what I want to do is basically share my journey and kind of what I've learned, share a few tips and tools. And then at the end of this, we can have a discussion and ask some questions. And if we do have time, and I guess we could have as much time as we want, I'm going to do an online demo. So if any of you are interested in your family from the US or from Europe, if you know their names and where they were from, I'll try to do a quick search and see if we can find anything and reveal anything that might be of interest. Now, if your name is Smith or Jones or something like that, it's going to be hard for me to find anything. But if you have something that's a little bit more unique, I probably be able to find something. And if you know where your relatives were from, that would even be helpful. So I want to start this by saying, I'm not professional at this. You know, I'm an engineer, and basically can do some research. I can do some documentation. When I was a kid, I collected coins. And in many ways, this is like collecting coins. It's like finding rare family finds. But I'm not the professional. Now, I have 2 cousins that are online, Amy Langus Rubin and Shelley Levin. Shelley's my first cousin. I guess Amy's probably a second cousin. They're 2 people that joined this journey, and I'll talk about this in a little bit. And I think they have a whole lot more information than I have. And so as we get into the discussions and questions and answers, they may be able to provide some more information than I'm going to share tonight. So, you know, why did I do this? And a lot of people have asked me. And I guess the bottom line for me is that I really had no data. My parents and grandparents, I never really talked that much about their family. And I said, well, you know, it'd be really nice to pass this on to my kids so I can learn about the family history. It was an opportunity to meet new family members that I never knew. I was very curious, and I thought this was a great challenge. So but I think the bottom line for me, it's about documenting the history and passing it on. So I started this journey back in 1997, so it's 23 years. And let me just tell you a little bit about my family. So both of my parents were born in the United States. My mother was born in Cleveland, Ohio. Her parents were both born in the same town called Grajewa in Poland. They met in the United States and got married in the United States. I was fairly close with both of them. They lived in Cleveland. I kind of grew up with them, and they were almost like second parents. We were so close. So I did hear a lot of stories about their families growing up. My dad was born in New York City. I didn't know too much about his family. His mother was born in New York, and her family was from Austria. His father came as a young child. He was born in Kiev, but he was very young when he came over. And I knew a little bit. I knew my dad's brother, and I heard stories about aunts and uncles, but I didn't know very much about that. My wife's family, my wife was born in Italy, and she was a daughter of survivors. Her father was from Poland outside of Warsaw. Her mother was Romania. And her family tree is kind of what I've been working on most lately because it's a lot of blacks. And I'll talk about that in some of the discussion later on. Okay, so what did I know when I started? You know, on my mother's family, I knew my great-grandparents, their siblings, birth locations, and some of their descendants. Whoops, I skipped a slide. So what do I know today? Okay, I'm sorry. So now what I know is I know about 8 generations of my mother's family on both sides, some as early as the mid-1700s. I know my grandparents, all their siblings and descendants. I know my great-grandparents, all their siblings and descendants, and many of my great-great-grandparents, siblings and descendants, quite a few number of people. And part of the journey, I've met a lot of these, their ancestors, or I should say their descendants along the way. So quite a few people on my mother's family. My father's family, I know my great-grandparents, all their siblings, their birth locations, and most of their descendants. And I know 1 generation beyond that, so it's my great-great-grandparents. And my wife's family still not very much. I know a little bit about their parents and their siblings, but that's about it. Okay. What's been interesting, and I kind of counted it up, was I've met at least 50 family members that I did not know of. I've talked to them, I've communicated with them, mostly on email. Some of them I did Skype. And I have 2,813 people in the family tree with 6,800 records. That means data that we've been able to accumulate. So that's where we are today. So this is the fun part, is where the journey started. So it all started in 1997, and I was kind of curious about it. And I knew my maternal grandmother, her name was Pauline Lipoff, her maiden name was Pauline Langus, and she was the last of my grandparents to pass away. She died in 1980. So, you know, I knew a lot about her. She had a family club in Cleveland, so I knew some of her. I knew her 2 sisters that lived in Cleveland, and so I knew a lot of these people. So I figured this was going to be a good place to start. So I did a registration in JewGen, and it was a great place to start. And so what I did was, this is the Jewish Generation or Jewish Gen site, and this is what comes up on the screen. You can find it if you look in Google. And there are things that you can do. You can search the database. You can list where your family was from. You can modify search. You can make new entries. And there's a whole lot of stuff behind this. So these are skipping around here. So I started here where it says list your family. And this is the page that I created. Now, this is not what it looked like in 1997. This is what it looks like today. And what I did was I put my grandmother surname, where she was born, her father, where he was born, her mother, where she was born. And these were my paternal grandparents. I should say this is my mother's father, where he was born. And then this is the rest of the family, and these are where my wife's family are from. So that's what was posted in 1997. And I don't know, it was about a year later, and Amy's on the line. She probably can tell you a little bit about this. But I think it was 1999. I got an email from this woman called Amy Rubin, and she said her maiden name was Langus, which is the same name as my grandmother. And so she said her family was from such and such a place, and I shared my family was such and such a place, and she talked about all her aunts and uncles, and I talked about all my aunts and uncles. And the town that her family was from was maybe 40 miles away from where my grandparents were born, but we couldn't make a match, all right? So I sent her this picture. I had this picture, and on the right is my great-grandfather. His name was Ephraim Langus. And on the left was somebody else. He looked like he was older than him, an older gentleman. you know, maybe a relative, maybe a brother, they kind of looked alike. And I don't know, within an hour of sending this to Amy, I got a note back from her and she said, we're related. She says, my grandmother has this same photo. And sent a chill up my back. And the unknown person was an older brother of my great-grandfather. His name was Morris Langus. And it was Amy Langus's great-great-grandfather. Amy's a little younger than me, so we're a little bit off, but he was maybe 10 years older than my great-grandfather. So this was the start. And I began a dialogue with Amy. And this is how the journey went. So Amy had been doing a lot of research. And at this time, there wasn't that much material that was available online. And so she somehow, she didn't tell me exactly how she did it, but she got somebody over in Poland that could look into the archives. And between the two of us, we documented as much as we could about Morris's family and Ephraim's family. Quite a few people, because they were all, you know, like a lot of kids, a lot of grandchildren and so forth. And then along the way, and Amy will tell exactly how this happened, but we met Audrey Waxman. Well, Audrey Waxman's great-grandfather was Abraham Langus. And he was another brother of Ephraim's. And she was into this genealogy. So the three of us now documented three brothers. And we contacted another, we found another person. And I found him by just, at the time, going through all the people in Skype that had the name of Langus. And I contacted every one of them. And I found this fellow named Harold Langus. Turns out his great-grandfather was Chaim Langus. He had changed his name, I don't remember what it was after Chaim, but he had a documentation of his family. And then when I did more research, it turns out that when my grandmother came to this country, she stayed with an uncle that lived in New York. Turns out it was Chaim Langus. This is her father's brother who came over in like 1902. Really interesting. And then really along this way, I got my cousin Shelley Levin involved, and she got hooked. I mean, this became her passion. This was her hobby. This became her life. And she jumped into this thing, hook, line, and sinker. And she got into the Polish archives. And, you know, she passed me up in terms of her ability to do research. And she's continued that. And she's been to conferences. And at the end of this presentation, Shelley can come on and tell a little bit about her background too. So that's where the journey went. And just to show at this time how primitive it was, this is how I documented everything that we learned. I was really pretty expert in Excel. And so I put a sheet together, and at the bottom of the sheet, you can see this was the page, and this was the brothers. There were some questions on some other brothers potentially. This was my great-grandfather's father, which we found along the way. His name was Sroll, or Israel Langus. And then his father was Joseph Langus. So we knew this. And then on this, we created a tab for each of the siblings of my great-grandfather. So this was Ephraim's page, and I put a whole page together with names and dates. This was Morris's page. And I had a lot of data on here: born, death. I was able to get social security numbers, where they're living, who their spouses were, when they were married. Again, very primitive, but it was a very good way to document it. So let me just talk about some of the early research methods that I used. So the first thing that I did when I wanted to find people outside of this country was using the Jewish Gen. And if you do want to start, a good place to start is on the search page. And I went to the Poland page, and on the Poland page, there was a shtetl finder, and I looked at Grajewo, which is where my grandparents were from. And here was something where I looked up Langus, and there were these number of records, considerable number of records. And this was what one of the pages looked like. So you can see here's a picture, data on my great-grandfather, his brother, his father. So, you know, there was a lot that I could find. And I know Shelley went much further than I did in terms of researching that. As I mentioned earlier, I contacted every Longus that was in Skype. And what I learned was that there were Longuses. Any Longus was my family unless they were born in Slovenia. And they were all related. I found people in Russia, I should say Estonia. I found people that weren't Jewish anymore. We never really made a connection, but we knew enough that they were related. But I contacted everyone on Skype. Used to be, I think you can still get a white pages of the whole United States, and I got every Longus in the United States. This was before there was Facebook. So I contacted many of these people. Google, I did a search, and I'm going to tell you about this search that came up interesting. I got a Rebecca Longus from Cienfuegos in Cuba, came up. She was the head of the Jewish community in Cienfuegos. So this is like maybe 2001 or 2002, and I had a contact at the Federation in Cincinnati that had a contact in the Jewish agency. And she wrote me back a letter in Spanish. And it turns out that her grandfather, I guess, was my grandmother's first cousin. He tried to come to the United States in 1913, couldn't get in. He ended up in Cuba, brought his wife over from Poland, and they had family, and most had left in 59, but she stayed on. And interestingly enough, when people make tours of Cuba, I have met probably a half a dozen people, maybe even more, that had visited her because she leads the Jewish community in that area. That was just one example there. There used to be a good way to look at Social Security indexes. I don't know if that's still around, but I did a search that way. And more recently, on Facebook. Facebook is a pretty easy way to find people. I was able to make a lot of contacts in later years. And, you know, I mentioned Cuba, met family in Israel, Uruguay, Estonia, Sweden. We found out some of our family was coming to the United States, and they stopped off in Sweden and stayed. And one of our club members, one of our officers, Benny Sommerfeld, is from the same town in Sweden, and he actually knew my family that's in Sweden. And we met people in Canada, so just all over the place. It's been really exciting. And so continue to do this documentation in Excel. Shelley did her research. Now, after we finished, I went to my dad's family, and it turned out, I found out that they had organized a family group in 1939, and they actually created and documented a book in 1940. And this book really laid out everybody. They had a president, they had board of trustees. And you got to remember, my great-great-grandfather had something like 13 or 14 siblings. They all lived in New York. And so, you know, by 1940, there was a lot of people in this family tree. And each page, this is a page with my great-great-grandfather, and his children. This was my dad, his father. And so I took this page and I started to document all of that. And I created a Word file in kind of a same way that Shelley had been documenting things. So at least I had this done. And in my search, I found that people were using Facebook to create communities. Lipovitz was my grandfather's name in Europe, and he became Lipov when he came here, and one of his cousins was Witriol. And there was a Witriol Lipovitz family website still there in Facebook. And then I found another with I.M. Mutnick, and I've contacted all these people, and I've had some really great conversations. Now, Graeva, which is where my great-grandparents were from, is something that Shelley created a site with the Jews of Graevo, and there are 310 members. And it's really very interesting. And part of one of the things that she did was she led an effort to translate the memorial book from Graevo. So again, all of this stuff is kind of like, it just continues to snowball and gain momentum. And you know, you can only put so much time in it, but the more time you spend, the more things you find. The big breakthrough in terms of finding family was when we began using Ancestry.com. Shelley contacted me, she'll correct me later, I don't know, maybe it was 4 years ago, and she says, I've got all of this research that I've done. It's all over, but it needs to be organized. And I said, look, you do the research, I'll do the organization. And we talked about it, and we agreed that we would use Ancestry.com as our method for documentation. And we gradually added her work, my work to this. And then it basically then it exploded, because the capability of Ancestry.com to do research is incredible. And it's easy. I'll show you in a second. You know, one of the things, once you put data in, and it's so smart, it gives you hints. And it connects you to census data, key vital data, births, marriage, death, Social Security, other family trees. There's one fellow, I'm kind of off topic. There's one family tree that a guy's family was from Graevo. The name is Larry Canner. He's got over 30,000 names in his database. He's got all our family there and other families. But the anecdote is this is how things are funny. I sent a note to Larry, and I said, Larry, you know, do you have any family here in Charleston? I have a friend whose name is Joey Canner, and we swim on the same swim team together. He sends me a note back right away. He says, that's my brother. You know, who would know? So these are the kind of crazy, fun things that happens when you do this exploration. So I'm going to give you a little demo on Ancestry and show you a little bit about how some of these things work. And then we can do a Q&A. And well, I'm going to talk a little bit about DNA, and then we'll do a Q&A. Okay, so here's some of the functions. First of all, as a search, you put in the data, you know, names, last names, place, what do you know? And it will come back and it will give you all sorts of information. You can find multiple trees. These are trees that we have in Ancestry with connections to. And here's the Newman Canner treehouse, they call it, the one that has 30,000. And my cousin has a tree here. And we found a Mutnik tree, and there's other trees that I don't have here of family members. Now, in many ways, each person, the 2,800 people, or how many ever we have people in the family tree, each have a homepage. And this is what their homepage looks like. So Yosel Lipov was my great-grandfather. He was born in 1880 in Graevo. He died in Cleveland in 1953, and I actually remember him as a very young boy. And here's a kind of a list of his facts, you know, when he was born, when his children were born, when he came to the United States, 1929. His kids came to the United States before he did, all but one, death of a sister. Here's a list of ancestry records that we found. List his parents, his wife, and all his siblings. And I like this page because this was an easy page for me to add data as I learn more. Here's a page that shows all of the, this is called a gallery. And some of my pages, you know, I have 20, 30, 40 pictures of people, family pictures, and then there's data that we have. And there's also an opportunity for people to create a story. Again, I haven't done this, A lot of people do this, but it's certainly a good way to pass on information to your successors, your children. Now, this is just a snapshot of the center part of my immediate family tree. And so the thing that I found most interesting was, as I put this all together, you would start getting hints. These hints are these leaves. And so I got these 2 hints on this tree a couple days ago when I put the presentation together. So I looked at what the hint was. And so Louis Lipoff, which was a brother of my mother's father, Abe Lipoff, just popped up. And this was just recently posted. They put in all the World War II draft cards. And this was his World War II draft cards. And so, I took a look at it. I opened it up. I said, it's him, because I knew from this data, this was his name. I knew this was his father. He was from Cleveland. It all fit. I said yes, and it basically then attached to his. So that's the ancestry piece of documentation. So maybe 2 years ago, my wife and I did a DNA test. Did it kind of curious, see what we could learn, see if we could find anybody else. My son did one, it's 23andMe, which I'll talk about in a moment. So here's the homepage of my results. No surprise, I came back as 100% Jewish. There's some people that get a surprise that come back 50% Jewish or 20 or 75% Jewish, and they just don't understand it. The next page talks about the matches. The 10 starred matches here are stars that I put in there. And these are matches of people that I know. But there were 1,000 people that were 4th cousins or closer. And I think there were like 3,000 matches altogether. I don't know how many generations it goes back. Now, when they say fourth cousins or closer, some places where they listed 3rd cousins, they were actually 2nd cousins. But it shows where my family was from. Primarily in the kind of the Central and Western Europe, which is consistent with what I know. Some from Poland, some from the southern or the Austria part of Poland back the turn of the century. And so everybody gets this. So you get a feeling of where they were from. My wife's, interesting enough, was she came back about 20% from Spain, Greece, and Northern Africa. And now her grandmother was born in Romania. So we're pretty sure that she has Sephardic roots based on her DNA test, which was kind of a surprise to her. So this is like the first of many, many different pages that comes up with the DNA test. And so I just picked out a few at random, but so at the top, and those that are experts at what DNA results are, these numbers are numbers that could help do research. And so this is my sister. This was my dad's 1st cousin who just passed away. He was about 95 years old. This was his son, who would be a 2nd cousin. Aviv Langus is also a 2nd cousin. His father was a brother to, his grandfather was a brother to my grandmother. This is another 2nd cousin, and this is another 2nd cousin. So all of these other people at the time, I did not know. What is an interesting thing is you can take a look at comparisons. So for example, I took a look at Steve Rossman, who I knew was a 2nd cousin. I had met him. And by doing this, I can take a look at who are our common relatives. So when I took a look at this, all of these people being common relatives, and I knowing that Seymour Rossman was my dad's first cousin, I know all of these people were from my dad's father's side. And I started contacting all of them. I could send them an email, and many of them, we were able to get matches on the family tree. So this is, I don't expect you to understand this, but what I did was I created an Excel file. And here were the names of kind of like the first, second, and third cousins, and I put them across the top. And this was allowed me to figure out where in the family they were related. And the color codes were people that I'd contacted, and I made definitive matches. But I did find out a lot of people that I never knew about that were second and third cousins. I found people that had some pretty famous people in the family that I had no idea that they were related. For example, I found out I had a cousin whose husband was the founder of the Phoenix Suns basketball team. You know, who would know? And on and on. You know, so a lot of these stories about people that I never even dreamed I'd know about. So this was kind of interesting to find. So kind of one last story about the DNA. I think I mentioned to you at the beginning of the presentation that my wife knew very little about her family. When I looked at her DNA tests, she also had a considerable number of family. And we contacted, you know, all the ones that were like third cousins. We couldn't connect any one dot. So we're pretty sure that they all came towards the beginning of the 20th century. So there was no opportunity to really make that connection. But my son did a 23andMe test. And he came up with two relatives, close relatives in my wife's family. And I don't know, about 6 months ago, we had a conversation with them on the phone. And this sent chills up our back. Both of these women were born in Cleveland, Ohio. They were born 3 blocks from where my wife lived in Cleveland, Ohio. They were my wife's second cousins. These two women's father and my wife's mother were first cousins, and their respective grandmothers were siblings. And my wife, lived in Cleveland with one uncle, had no family that she knew of, except a few relatives in Israel. And so anyway, we've been exchanging notes, and the interesting thing is that these two women really have most of the history of my wife's mother's family. Many of them are living in Israel. Shirley did find a grandmother in Israel, but not as a result of this, and that's a whole other story. But it really sent chills, and we're becoming friends with them. One of them lives not too far from us in Florida. So again, that's our journey. And the other thing that's really interesting about this is that one of the women in our synagogue has a first cousin that lives in the town that my wife's mother was born in. And so the cousin has signed a legal document, so she's doing research. So she did find Shirley's mother's brother's birth certificate. And now we're going to send over all this information that we found on the family, and maybe we can get her family tree. So again, this networking, it's just terrific. So again, a missed opportunity. So I just want to tell you about one watch out if you do a DNA test, a real watch out. This is for the guys, okay? I think there's some women on. If you had any affairs before you got married or when you were married, be careful when you take a DNA test, because you wouldn't believe how many people have found family members like this. So, you know, I'll give you one story. I found a cousin that lives in Maryland, and he found a half brother. He couldn't believe it, you know. It turns out that his father was in high school during World War II, and the women that had husbands away overseas were inviting these 16 and 17-year-old boys over because they were lonely. Well, it turns out that his father, who was 16 years old, fathered somebody in 1945, which now my cousin that I met through this whole journey didn't want to contact him. And I've encouraged him to. I said, your father's gone. But I have a close friend here that on a DNA test who found 3 half siblings. His father, this little old Polish guy that was 5 foot, was running around. And he has contacted these siblings. And there's many more stories of this. So, it's just a heads up. So that's kind of the end of my story. And what I'd like to do is introduce you to Amy Rubin and Shelley Lovin. Could you unmute them?
I'm unmuted. This is Shelley.
Hi, Shelley.
Hi.
Shelley, is Amy on too?
Yeah, I think
Shelley,
she is.
Amy.
Yes, I'm here.
So Shelley, you've been sort of my alter ego on this whole thing. Do you want to add anything to this discussion before we do?
Just that I started in 2004 after my dad died. That's when I got interested because I found some documents he kept about the family that he had done from talking to relatives that are now deceased, but that was before the computer age. And so I found not only Ancestry.com, which is very invaluable. I really recommend that if you're interested in getting more serious work, but from the Jewish genealogy perspective, getting onto Jewish Gen, and particularly if you're Polish, a descendant, what's called JRI, Jewish Record Indexing, which is indexes from Poland, documents marriage, death, birth, things like that, and they're narrative. They're like a whole narrative of the wedding document. So for instance, our great-grandparents, Mike's and mine, there's a document that I have that talks about their wedding and some of the people that were there, the witnesses, and they're invaluable because then that's how you learn about the next 2 generations up, because they talk about their parents and their grandparents. So, and they're been indexed and they're online, and some of them are actually, you don't have to pay for them. Some of them are actually digitized online. Some you do have to request, and then you just get them translated. So they're wonderful. I mean, as Mike was saying, we've got some that go back to the 1800s. And so there's that, and there's all kinds of resources getting. You can find out the town if you're not sure which town in Europe they came from. You can often figure that out by getting their naturalization records, which are often on Ancestry.com. So there's a lot of things to do, and Jewish Gen does hold a really nice introduction to genealogy. So if you want to get started and need some assistance, that could be really helpful.
I want to introduce you to Amy, another cousin, and this is where the journey all started. But I've got to tell you a story about Amy before we go. So Amy and I had been corresponding, Shelley and Amy and Audrey Waxman and others for a number of years, and we had a wedding in Washington, D.C., and Amy lives near Washington, D.C., and she says, Mike, let's meet. So I said, well, should we meet at the Washington Monument? I said, all right, we did. Well, anyway, we get to the Washington Monument, and she said her husband's going to wear Ohio University shirt, I think is what you said. Anyway, there's a gazillion people there, and I'm up at the Washington Monument, and my wife is down kind of at the bottom of the hill, and all of a sudden I see her jumping up and down, and she saw Amy, and she looked at Amy in the face. She says, Amy, you look just like Mike's grandmother. Like pictures of my grandmother when she was, 25 years old, and she spotted her right away. And the ears. Amy, it's so good to see you. Do you want to add anything to what we?
I would love to. Thank you so much for inviting me to this. This is fabulous. I think the only other thing I'd probably add is that part of our journey really did involve Ellis Island, and we can't forget any of their records because they have amazing records. And they kind of like, when you're starting, you would start with like Ellis Island, and they would get you to maybe you might get a ship or a registry of what year. If you knew what year the family came over, you could kind of look at that. My grandparents were already in New York They were born here. So my great grandparents are the ones that had immigrated, and probably in 1900 something or other, 3 or 4, something like that. So all of the family was already here and in New York, again, probably through Chaim, to have to stop and make a connection, because you couldn't come unless you had a family member. And then they would then go off on these other places. So there's this place in the Bronx where everybody had to go until they moved out to Queens and, Brooklyn, whatever. That would get you, Ellis Island would get you to Social Security. And that's where we're like, well, I know my great grandparents' names. I start typing them in. And all of a sudden you get birthdays, you get Social Security numbers, you get a whole bunch of this stuff. And some of the information we took a long time. Mike and I took a long time in getting some of this stuff. And the list we got from Poland was incredible. It was from a gentleman in the UK who was doing this research, saw that I was looking for family members on Jewish Gen, and hooked us up. That's basically it. I couldn't tell you his name again if I tried, but it was really one of those things where you just started putting pieces together. I just told Mike last year in April, I'm trying to think, end of March. So this time of year last year, my grandmother passed away. She was 1 month from her 99th birthday. And this is my father's mother. And I said to my parents, there's a book in their house. She showed it to me once. When you clean out the house, I want the book, because our names are in the front cover. It's like a Torah. And she says, okay. They send me this stuff. I get a box full of stuff. Inside is the book. I see the page that I want. I'm so excited. I got the right book. I turn the page, and all the information that Mike and I were trying to get was right there. My grandmother's book. She had already written it down of who the mothers were and who was born when, and she had everybody's Social Security number on this thing. I guess when she would buy bonds, she needed everybody's number. I had been telling her for years that I was doing this research, and she never turned the page of the book. So at least we know we got it right. And I think putting all those pieces together and having all those connections. Mike, I sent you on Facebook Messenger a picture of Rebecca from Cuba with my father. Rebecca was written up in the New York Times. A whole big article. I was getting phone calls from cousins left and right. Did you see? I'm like, yeah, I already knew about it. There was a synagogue in Boston who sponsored her in 2009 to come to the United States. They would not bring her whole family because they felt like they might defect. So they brought her to the United States, and she was able to tell her story like it was from the New York Times. And when I got wind of this, I made sure I had people everywhere. So we had some cousins that came from Cleveland who went out to New York for one of her stops on her tour. 2 of my second cousins made stops. And then they stopped because I'm like, you cannot bring her here and not let her stop in Washington. They made a stop near us in Bethesda. So she was speaking at a synagogue in Bethesda, and we all went out to dinner. So that's what the picture is that I sent you, Mike.
So I probably didn't share with you, but we had a men's club meeting in Boston that year. And I met her. I had lunch with her in Boston with Hirsch. I forget her first name, the woman that did the articles with the New York Times, Linda Hirsch from the New York Times. And we had lunch with her and a translator. And so I did get a chance to meet her. And, the other thing is we've had probably 3 or 4 missions from Charleston, and they've all met her. And one of our past international presidents in Chicago calls me up and he said, I met Rebecca. He was in San Fuegos, and he met her too, and he had a picture with her.
This is Rebecca. I don't know if it switches the screen or not, if anybody can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
So this is Rebecca and my father. They are first cousins.
So I've got one other story to tell, and then I want to open up to questions and answers. So my grandmother came to the United States in 1914. She came at 15 and a half years old to spend a summer with Chaim. That's all. And she lied. She said she was 18 years old. And then she got stuck in World War I, and she never went back. She got married a few years later when she indeed was 18 years old. Her siblings came over, I don't know, right after World War I, but she had three much, much younger siblings. And the area that he lived in, Poland, after World War I, became Germany, because it was in the Prussian, right in the border, they were Prussian. And so the family moved, other than the father, my great-grandfather, they all moved to Germany. And in 1933, you probably don't know this story, Amy. In 1933, one of my grandmother's brothers was friends with somebody that was in the Nazi party. And they were like this close to each other. And he came up to, his friend came up to my cousin and said, "Max, the Germans are going to kill all the Jews." He says, "You've got to get out. I'm going to get you out." So the three siblings and all their kids in 1933 went to Israel. But we've maintained contact. So one of their children, which was my mother's first cousin, can't figure that out, visited with us in Washington. She had dinner with you, Amy. You remember Moishe, right? And met your father. And he said he saw your father and the blood went out of his face because your father looked like his father.
Oh yeah, they all look the same.
They all look the same.
They're all, that guy in the picture, if you take the beard off, looks just like my great uncle. Identical.
So anyway, so there's a lot of stories. I'm going to open up to questions and answers, and I'm going to ask Alan. You know how to do this, so.
This is Shelley. I just want to give one other tip if you're just starting out, is to find the city, like ours was Cleveland, or if it's New York, or wherever your family went, contact their local Jewish genealogy society, and they will help you with all the different resources, genealogy resources for your town. I found that to be very helpful for the Cleveland Jewish Genealogy Group.
Yeah, I'm going to unmute. Okay, who wants to ask a question?
I have I'll ask the question.
Shoot.
Why don't we do this, Alan?
Yeah.
Whoever has a question, raise their hand, and then you'll unmute.
Okay.
Sonny Steinberg has a question.
Okay, let me unmute him. Give me a second. Sonny. Go ahead.
Well, this is not Sonny. Sonny is my wife, but this is Samuel Steinberg. So,
well, I had to say that because that's what's on the screen.
That's okay. That's all right. I don't have a question. I just I don't know if you're familiar with a book that's been published by a lot of European communities that suffered during the Holocaust. They were called the Yiska books. I have one. My father's family came from Belarus, from Kobron, and there was a very large Jewish community there, and they do mention the Steinberg name in the book. But I've tried to now that the Steinberg, those people, the majority of them came to the States or went to Israel. I don't know what happened. I'm sure the rest of them passed away or whatever. But I can't find anything. I can't make any connection. Matter of fact, I have a cousin in Atlanta who went to Kobron to try to make a contact, and he met some people. But there's I couldn't find anybody that was related to my great grandfather. I mean, that's where it stopped. Was with my great grandfather Steinberg. So I didn't know if you were familiar with the Yiska books.
Well, why don't you unmute Shelley for a second, because Shelley, why don't you talk about your journey, what you've done?
Well, we have the Yisker book, our memorial book. It's the same thing, is written. Many towns in Europe have them, many of the small shtetls, and they are written usually by the people who survived the war. And so from our family town, I helped get it translated from Yiddish into English. You can find Yisker books from your town if it's been written on Jewish Gen, if you go to that website. But in terms of trying to find some of your relatives, you might be able to find connections if you go on the Yad Vashem website, and also on the Jewish Gen, where you have a lot of the documents from Europe, and may be able to find your great-grandfather and any other relatives. You know, if you take
I don't know my great-grandfather's siblings.
Right, you might be able to find them on Jewish Gen.
I know this is Alan Cahan. I'm a Yahoo listserv of family from Zamish, Poland, which my father's parents were from. And one day I see that a man who was doing research had translated the Yisker book into English. And so within literally about 2 minutes from that thing, I emailed him. I said, "How much is the book and how can I get it?"
Mhm.
He said $75. I sent him a wire of $75, and 3 days later I had the book that he had translated, and there were obviously names of relatives who had perished and a lot of other interesting things. So yeah, I found when my father came, my mother's father came over, he had no connection with his family. And it was only as a result of digging in a first cousin's archives that his father kept that I saw a connection between he and another name. Someone had created a website. That's another thing to do. Look to see whether there is family names in the city. And there was this woman that had created a website. I sent her the documentation, and then later found out, met a fourth cousin. So yeah, it's fascinating, the journey.
One of the things I want to mention, I was going to mention at the closing, is that Ancestry.com does have a service where you can hire, and I met the researcher actually when I was at the GA in Israel. They have a researcher that does Jewish research. You basically give them a stipend, whatever, $5,000, $10,000. I know somebody here in town that's having them do that. And they actually go over to Europe and they look at the records and things like that. I was about to do that for my wife's family until my son's DNA test came forward. And I think we've got now enough clues that we can start the journey for her. Other questions? Comments?
I'm not sure if I'm going to question.
Shabbat morning classes, which is very nice. I am lucky enough now that even when we have our intermittent Shabbat morning services, there is still opportunity for me to jump in on the Shabbat morning services, Shabbat morning class students, which in the past I have not.
I think we have two things going on.
So we've doubled up on school stuff. The students have, as I say, been well attended, but the activity.
I got a question. Mike?
Yep.
This is Craig Browdy. I was just wondering on the documentation part, there's lots of different software out there. There's Genie and there's Ancestry.com. Do you have any idea how hard it is to move records from one to the other, and whether you can, by cross-referencing, learn things that you otherwise wouldn't know?
So I haven't got that far. I know that I have downloaded as backup my full file, and it's a .gd something god file. I forgot what it's called, but there's a file on that. But I think that Heritage, whatever it is, MyHeritage, which is kind of the main competitor with Ancestry, I haven't figured out how to cross-reference between those. I'm on MyHeritage, but they keep wanting to have more money from me to get at a higher level so that I could see records. So I don't know. I'm going to ask Shelley. She might know the answer to
No, I don't know. I'm sure you can upload old documents onto Ancestry, but I don't know how.
The thing is that I think that my whole database can be loaded into something like MyHeritage, and I could just, if I wanted to
Yeah,
join them, I could do that.
I'm question.
yeah, this
Uh,
is,
I have a question when there's an opening. Can you hear me? I'm not sure
I
I'm
can hear
getting
you.
across.
this is Neil.
This is Hal Freed. Can anybody hear me?
I can.
We
Okay.
can hear you.
I was working with somebody who's done a lot, and she was concerned about putting her stuff out on web-based websites from a security point of view, putting social security numbers or things like that. Any concerns, and how do they handle security?
I have a lot of concerns. This is Shelley, and I personally on these databases, I only would prefer to put people who are deceased and no living family members because for that particular reason, but I'm a little more paranoid about it than others.
Yeah, this is Neil Smith. The name has changed, obviously, and I've done a little of this. You've talked a lot about your own family and your own experience, but I'd like to broaden that to a little bit of the experience with these various databases and various things. And ancestry on the DNA side, what do you think of the use of 23andMe or Ancestry and the experience there? And then also, I know the Mormon Church has a large database, and whether that's been helpful and available to you.
Well, I'm going to start answering the first question. You know, the DNA test that we did. I don't know which is better, the 23andMe, but I did the Ancestry only because it synchronizes with the Ancestry database, and I'm able now to take each of my connections and list it and connect it directly to my tree. Is the 23andMe better than that? I don't know. I think some of these also provide some medical DNA testing. In terms of the Mormon, I think Shelley's had some experience with Mormon church.
Excellent. And there is a website, I don't remember off the top of my head what it's called, but Family Search, I think it is. And there's a lot of overlap with Ancestry.com, but the difference is it's free. There's some things you can't find there, but you can on Ancestry.com. But if you want to not have to spend money, the Family Search has a lot of death certificates and birth certificates, and it's information from all over the world. So I really recommend that.
Any other questions? I'm going to share my screen. I've got some last thoughts here that I wanted to show. If I can. All right. So, some last thoughts. If I can get this to work. It's a lot of fun. I mentioned that there's a Jewish research department that you can use if you're not really into research yourself. You can pay them and they will go over, and apparently they're pretty good. Interview your relatives. You know, if I had 30 minutes with my grandmother, 30 minutes, if I had interviewed her, it would have saved her, and Shelley could probably tell me how many years worth of research she had in her head. The only relative that I had a chance to interview, turns out my grandfather had a younger sister that was about same age or maybe even younger than my mother. And I did interview her and got a lot of information. Much of that information I had already had at that point, but at least it corroborated what we had. So, you know, interview people, do it, you know, electronically so you can preserve it. And you know, amazing, especially if you can find anecdotes about things that are going to get lost when they pass. So those were the last points. And again, there's good tools on MyHeritage and Ancestry. they don't easily talk to each other, which I answered to Craig. But and again, what's the best about this was the opportunity to network. I mean, it's all about networking. You know, I mentioned 50 people in the family. There's people outside the family that I've been in contact with, and it's been a lot of fun. So I think we were scheduled for about an hour, so I'm probably not going to be able to do a demo. Let me see if I can undo the screen share. There we go. Does anybody have energy to stay on for a few minutes to do a demo? Have any burning desire to do some research? Alan, what would you like to do?
I've got a question
Go ahead.
or a comment. I guess for about 11 years, I was working with JP Morgan Chase credit cards in the risk and fraud area. And I'm hyper about sharing social security numbers. I think if there's any way you can keep that private, that's helpful, because there's so much fraud generated from social security that just be extraordinarily careful. Even if someone has passed away, I'm not sure. There may be ways that they can still utilize that information.
Well, that's
I
good.
found, 23andMe, when I did it, they took me back to 1881 for my grandfather and said 100% Jewish, but that didn't give me any new information. And I was looking for some new relatives or friends or whoever, new connections. Then they started with, well, you have to pay additional money and you got to keep doing this. And I just said, it sounds like a money-making institution. And I wasn't terribly happy with the results. So we didn't go any further on that one. But I think I heard Ancestry might have been a better way to do it.
I want to make a comment on the security. So first of all,
Yeah.
I don't know anywhere that we post social security numbers. Ancestry will give you the social security death record, but they don't give that number. I had social security numbers on that file that I have, but that's been well protected. And the other thing is Ancestry does have a function that says that all living people on your family tree are not searchable. It just shows up as a blank. So I don't share anything that's living. And the only people that I have to deliberately share with somebody who can see it. So, you know, we watch the security, but for sure we don't have anything with Social Security. Now, somebody raised their hand. Stephen.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Marty. How are you? So
Well-
I'll share this with you, but certainly with everyone. I've been doing genealogy for a very long time. Got into doing some DNA. I've been learning a little bit more about it. Something that you might want to consider is uploading your results. And you want to, you know, couch your username so that people really won't know who you are necessarily. But if you're comfortable in uploading your results, there are, except for Ancestry, you can upload to a website. FTDNA is another one of the DNA testing companies. So you get another pool of people that you can compare your 23andMe data to at FTDNA. MyHeritage will allow. I found recently that MyHeritage has a lot more international, I guess, international outside of the U.S. People who have tested. I found someone who was a DNA match. You say a DNA match, you have to be careful when you say that. We're all related, but a DNA match to my dad and living in Germany. Now, I knew who that person was because I had traced the tree and I actually knew who they were already, but they were second or third cousins, but they were living in Germany and they had tested there. So that's another one. So MyHeritage, FTDNA, and then there's also something like called a clearinghouse called GEDmatch. And GEDmatch will take DNA from all of those and it's so you get another pool of people that you can compare to. So don't feel cornered into 23andMe's results because you can still upload this for free. to these other sites. The only site that won't allow you to upload to is Ancestry. You can take Ancestry and upload it to the other sites, but you can't take the other sites and upload to Ancestry. So if you do test outside of Ancestry, or even with Ancestry, I would recommend consider uploading to those other sites, because you get to reach out to the other pools where people may not have done the same. And it's been a real benefit to do that.
Anybody else?
Anybody else?
All right.
Thank you.
Hey, Mike, I love your beard.
I hate it. It's coming off when I get a haircut.
I like it.
It's got it came in with 3 different colors too. You know, I got this is brown, and it's blonde here, and it's white here. So it's, you know, all over the place. Anyway.
Good
thanks,
presentation,
everybody.
Mike. Thank you.
Stephen, you want to stay on for a second? Okay. Where's Stephen? Is he still here?
Yeah.
Yep, I'm here. Sure.
So I'll share with you, if you want, I'll share with you my screen here, and you can tell me if this is the family that you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't think so, but we'll take a look.
All right, give me 1 second. Let me
Yep.
share.
Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Mike.
I'm going to stop the recording at this point.
That's good. Okay, let me find it.
Bye, Mike. I'm going to take